The Consortium of Classical Educators provides resources and regional connections for Christian families, teachers, and educational organizations to expand the reach of classical education and foster human flourishing for generations to come.
Thank you very much. It's a real joy to be here. I want to express again our thanks to Hillsdale and to the Blake Center here. This is remarkable, isn't it not? And I want to also give my deep thanks to Sarah for inviting Mary and myself to be here and to be part of this very first gathering of this kind here in New England. We live in turbulent times, do we not? Our culture is deeply divided. The educational community is at odds with itself and with the larger culture. Our social interaction is strained. Our churches are fractured along new lines that divide once established denominations and traditions. Our politics has entered a new phase of dysfunctionality and disaffection. In this situation, it is good and necessary to focus our attention on a tradition of learning and an approach to education that appears to many of our contemporaries as one stained with the unredeemable marks of racism, elitism, misogynism, oppression, repression, ignorance, and the rest of the isms that beset the puritanical righteous of our day. Of all people, we are the most benighted. Yet paradoxically, there has never been a more crucial time to read, discuss, engage, reflect, and emulate the traditions that have shaped us and that have provided the grounds for hope. Dickens' words concerning another time could be applied to our time. Quote, "It was the best of times." It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. And so it is. And so it has always been. Thus we must act in the present despite the chaos and confusion. We must actively trust that within and beyond all we experience, there is someone who is the creator and architect of meaning. We must seek the discernment to read our times carefully. As C.S. Lewis put it in Learning in Wartime, quote, "Most of all, we need intimate knowledge of the past. Not that the past has any magic about it, but because we cannot study the future and yet need something to set against the present, to remind us that the basic assumptions have been quite different in different periods, and that much which seems certain to the uneducated is merely temporary fashion. A man who has lived in many places is not likely to be deceived by the errors of his native village. A scholar has lived in many times and is therefore in some degree immune from the great cataract of nonsense that pours from the press and the microphone of his own day." Close quote. Although I will tease you with occasional quotes from Lewis, what follows will be my meditation on this remarkable essay. I will not read it to you. I want you to read it for yourselves. I hope, however, to provide you with an excuse to read it, if for no other reason, to try to figure out what I'm trying to say. The question that Lewis addresses in this essay is still our question, but the context in which we live has made the answer he gives more difficult to grasp. The basic argument of the essay is therefore even more important to our situation than the challenges posed by World War II were to his. I will proceed in the following way. First, I will try to define the words in my title. The words philosophy, good, duty. Second, I will point to the impact of bad philosophy that continues to distort our understanding of reality and of truth. Third, I will offer my thoughts about learning. All this fits under the heading of meditation, or maybe musings of someone who has been thinking about these things for over 50 years. So first, definitions. Of course, I'm venturing into dangerous waters. In our cultural setting, it is scandalous to assert that words can be given a limited range of meaning and that conflicts concerning the meaning of words are adjudicated by rational discourse. But if I am to engage Lewis and the vast tradition of learning that precedes our contemporary moment, then I must try to define my terms and establish the grounds of possible communication. For the purpose of this talk, I will define philosophy in the following way. Philosophy is the persistent and systematic effort to examine the assumptions that underlie our struggle to comprehend the nature of reality, to define the ways in which we try to understand reality, to assess the judgments we make as we recognize the value of reality and the values within reality as a place of possible human flourishing, and to relate all of this to the wonder and mystery of life that envelops us and shapes our implicit awareness of limits and possibilities. If we're going to pursue philosophy well, although we do so imperfectly, then another additional axiom must also be followed. Fact and value, reason and imagination, truth and meaning must be linked together and related to some notion of human flourishing. As many of you know, this definition of philosophy is fraught with critically important questions. I will not try to unpack those questions today. But I do want to emphasize 2 points that may be very obvious to you. First, all philosophical thinking and all thinking of any kind is based upon assumptions about reality. St. Anselm, following the thought of St. Augustine, put it this way: faith seeking understanding. I will return to the question of faith later in this talk. But for now, take note. There are no assertions that are not based upon absolute presuppositions. The task of philosophy is to bring to light all those presuppositions and make a case for those assumptions that fit the experience of humanity as a whole. Not just my experience and not just your experience. And part of that assessment must be related to our best understanding of the flourishing life. Second, it should be obvious to you that the central subject of philosophy is unavoidably axiological in nature. That is, philosophy is concerned with value and values, like good and evil, beauty and ugliness, virtue and vice, good ends and self-destructive ends. This leads me to the second word in my title, good. There's a major stream of contemporary thought which would assert, often without any argument, that all values are relative, and therefore the attempt to even define the word good is laughable at best and profoundly ignorant at worst. I must confess that to convey a bit of this contemporary debate, I had to use the term best and the term worst. Do you see how difficult all this really is? We can't escape the question, nor can we avoid the use of value terms. Even the word fact is a value term. We say that something is a fact when our description of that fact comports or agrees with our experience of reality. The description of that thing is a value statement, a fact statement. And when we express that fact statement, we mean it is valuable to our understanding of reality. Remember, philosophy is ultimately about reality. Even the assertion that all value terms are relative is a contradiction. Think about it. The absolute statement is presented as absolutely true, which means it cannot be relative. And so the statement, all value judgments are relative, is false. So, what do I mean by the word good? Or better, what does Lewis mean when he writes, good philosophy must exist if for no other reason because bad philosophy needs to be answered? In light of my definition and my axiom, good philosophy is the kind of philosophical thinking that illumines the nature of reality in such a way that our knowledge is clarified and the end or goal of human flourishing is a bit more visible to us. Bad philosophy distorts reality and our shared discussion of the ends or goal of human life. So good is not just an expression of emotion or blind instinct or deterministic will or material necessity, but is a value-laden term that is linked inextricably to our common experience of reality and human flourishing. If we can successfully assert that at least one thing is good, we can reject the claim that all value language is relative. The third term in my title presents difficult challenges, but maybe there is a way to approach it now. That term is the term duty. Duty is out of favor today. Duty is understood as an evil by those who assert that all values are relative. Historically, classically, duty is a virtue. Often is attached to the virtue of courage or to the virtue of practical wisdom. At the heart of the tradition of virtue ethics, there is a curious notion. The virtues are both the means and the end of excellence or virtue. If I want to learn to play the Moonlight Sonata on the piano before an adoring audience, then I must be willing to learn the disciplines needed to play the piano with excellence. Those necessary disciplines, scales, which I hated, finger exercise, which I hated more, sight reading, and the like, are the virtuous means by which I gain the everyday disciplines necessary to play well. When I am ready and the audience is in place, then I play the Moonlight Sonata with excellence. Virtue is both the means and the end to which I strive. Or, as a wrestling coach with no neck told me repeatedly, practice does not make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect. The active condition of one's life, the settled convictions by which you live each and every day. If it is a good related to the fullness of the flourishing life, then it is the virtuous means by which you receive a glimpse of virtue well lived. Duty, understood as a virtue, is an action arising out of the center of our being that is consistent with the goal or end of virtue as a flourishing life. It does not mean that you will avoid suffering. It does not mean that you will always succeed. It does not mean that you will never doubt or fear. Rather, you will act, even in the face of your doubts and fears, toward the good. It will be messy sometimes. It will be hard every time. But remember, all the great stories ever told or ever lived will give you a picture or model of what real duty is. If we can provisionally accept these three definitions, then we can focus on my title as a whole. My concern is to reflect on the notion that we have a duty to actively pursue good philosophy rather than bad philosophy. Or, to put this in other terms, if we are to live well, if we are to try to join with others in building communities that provide the liberty to work together toward the goal of a flourishing life and a flourishing community, then we must pursue good philosophy and reject the pursuit of bad philosophy. An example of bad philosophy. At this point, I think, as you well know, I could introduce many examples of bad philosophy. But I have chosen an example of bad philosophy as articulated by a representative thinker, largely overlooked, whose ideas have influenced a number of fields of study. Although he absorbed the contributions of many others, his synthesis of their ideas directly influenced the intellectual course of the 20th century. His name is Max Weber. Max Weber was born in 1864 and he died in 1920. After a legal education, his academic work shaped the disciplines of political economy, sociology, the sociology of religion, and the remaining social sciences. Despite challenges to his health, Weber taught at Freiburg and Heidelberg, edited 2 different sociological journals, deeply influenced the development of sociological methodology, and influenced German political life as a public intellectual. In November 1917, during World War I, Weber was asked by students at the University of Munich to deliver a formal lecture. He entitled it, "Science as a Vocation." The main theme of the lecture emerges as Weber begins to define science. The German word used by Weber, often translated by the English word science, refers to all the disciplines that require systematic thinking. This term includes all of the arts and sciences found in the typical American college. In his lecture, Weber argues that the systematic disciplines require, quote, strict specialization, close quote, and the self-knowledge or self-acknowledgement by the scientist that, quote, what he has accomplished will be antiquated in 10, 20, or 50 years, close quote. The work of a scientist or systematic thinker is the realization that it is a fraction, he says, quote, fraction, the most important fraction of the process of intellectualization, close quote. Weber then defines what this process of intellectualization is. So here's the quote. Intellectualization means that principally there are no mysterious, incalculable forces that come into play, but rather one can, in principle, master all things by calculation. This means that the world is disenchanted. One need no longer have recourse to magical means in order to master or implore the spirits, as did the savage, for whom such mysterious powers existed. Technical means and calculations perform the service. This, above all, is what intellectualization means. This process of disenchantment, which has continued to exist in Occidental culture for a millennia, and in general, this progress to which science belongs as a link and motive force. Close quote. Wow. Allow me to emphasize the importance of this quote. Science as calculation is the most important driving force in the process of intellectualization. This process will never end. An individual contribution by an individual scientist is rendered meaningless by the process. All wonder and all mystery is reduced to calculation. Hence, our leaders today repeat incessantly the slogans, "Follow the science," or "The data says." The world is the exclusive domain of material and natural forces that have no purpose or end. In Weber's own words, what the civilized person, quote, seizes is always something provisional, not definitive, and therefore death for him is a meaningless occurrence. And because death is meaningless, civilized life as such is meaningless. By its very progressiveness, it gives death the imprint of meaninglessness. Closed quote. This insight causes Weber to ask, what is the value of science? In his effort to answer this question, Weber dismisses the notions rooted in our common history, beginning with the ancient Greeks, that science or intellectualization is the way to true being, or the way to true art, or the way to true nature, or the way to true God, or the way to true happiness. Despite the failure of science to substantiate its value, Weber suggests there are two ways that science may yet prove some use. First, Weber argues that science is important because it, quote, presupposes the rules of logic and method are still valid. And second, he asserts that knowledge emerging from scientific work is, quote, worth being known, close quote. However, in this same lecture, Weber acknowledges science itself cannot prove that either one of these presuppositions is true. Here is the problem. Science, on the basis of its own methods, that is, science as systematic thinking, on the basis of its own methods, can neither prove that knowledge itself nor the, quote, existence of the world which these sciences describes is worthwhile, that it has any meaning, or that it makes sense to live in such a world, close quote. Weber goes on to assert that this question cannot be answered by medicine, or aesthetics, or by jurisprudence, or by the historical and cultural sciences, or by sociology. Science can only prove three things, according to Weber. First, a, quote, contribution to the technology of controlling life. Secondly, a, quote, method of thinking. And third, the process that produces clarity. The disenchanted world asserts that, quote, science freed from presuppositions in the sense of a rejection of religious bonds, and therefore does not know of the miracle and the revelation. If it did, science would be unfaithful to its own presuppositions, close quote. Christian monotheism has only provided, Weber argues, the basis for the emergence of the, quote, grandiose rationalism of an ethical and methodical conduct of life, close quote. The driving intellectualization of modernity, thus set in motion, has created a new situation in which, quote, the routines of everyday life challenge religion, close quote. In this situation, Weber argues as follows. Listen closely here. This is strange to hear even. Many old gods ascend from their graves. They are disenchanted and hence take the form of impersonal forces. They strive to gain power over our lives. And again, they, the gods, resume their eternal struggle with one another. What is hard for modern man, especially for the younger generation, is to measure up to the everyday existence. The ubiquitous chase for experience stems from this weakness, for it is weakness not to be able to countenance the stern seriousness of our fateful times, close quote. This dynamic analysis by Weber posits an unending tension between a bureaucratic monotheism of rationality and a polytheistic struggle with privatized, subjective value structures leaving, quote, no objectively ascertainable ground for one's convictions, close quote. Weber includes in this analysis the theological task. He argues that theology is seeking to interpret the world using presuppositions that lie, quote, beyond the limits of science, close quote. Therefore, the assumptions and conclusions of theology do not, quote, represent knowledge. The tension, he says, between the value spheres of science and the sphere of the holy is unbridgeable, close quote. Let me pause here. I can see the blank stares. I teach philosophy. I'm used to this. Let me pause here for a minute. I hope you can catch this. Weber first argues that, quote, systematic thinking or science, this is the word he uses, must be reduced to calculation or mathematics. Then he acknowledges that science is unable to justify its value as calculation. So it must be reduced to calculation, but then I can't justify that. I can't give a reason for it. And then thirdly, Weber laments that this disenchanted understanding of the world will lead inevitably to futility, meaninglessness, the waning of religion, and the demise of science. Think about that. Think about what we experience in our culture even today. Let me sum up this version, Weber's version of bad philosophy. Values and meaning cannot be found embedded in any knowledge structure of the world. The disenchanted world of intellectualization produces the atomistic and polytheistic fragmentation of all values as a pervasive subjectivism which drives all discussion of meaning from public life. Heard that? In this setting, the scientist can only seek methodological clarity while acknowledging that her efforts will be rendered meaningless by the progress of science, and her eventual death will be devoid of significance. Weber gives us a prophetic vision of the dystopia of disenchantment and the presumed victory of a secularized culture. The vision is a prediction of our post-Christian, post-modern culture. He made this prediction in 1917. Think about that. In the long course of human history, 158 years, the course of his life from his birth to right now, 158 years, is not very long. But since Weber's lifetime, human beings around the world have lived through the bloodiest period in all human history. We have reaped the benefits of a third or fourth or fifth scientific revolution, but humans have also unleashed horror upon horror on the world. Totalitarianism, genocide, the Holocaust, 2 world wars, regional conflicts, genetic engineering, drug addictions, suicides, and the utter loss of meaning for untold millions of people. Those thinkers, often unwittingly, who pursued Weber's understanding of science, further deconstructed the role of reason, thereby accelerating the desacralization of life, which reduces human life to an exercise of raw power and visceral passion. The success of science did not dull the growing sense that life is without meaning and purpose beyond the accumulation of things or experiences. Culturally, we are empty and confused. The vulgar coarseness of our own day seems only to punctuate the deep intuition that nothing is ultimately meaningful. Dickens' words about the age of revolution haunt us as we roll our shopping carts through the crowded aisles of the local Walmart store. The warning from Lewis concerning bad philosophy and his encouragement to pursue good philosophy as a virtuous duty rings true. The crisis is real, but I must assert the resources for hope, the impetus for a recovery of an imaginative vision of a flourishing life, and a longing for the renewal of faith in the reality of an enchanted world alive with transcendent goodness is not dead and is not lost. We may think we are the center of the universe, but thank God we are not. Toward the recovery of learning. The definition of philosophy that I presented at the beginning of this talk can provide a starting point for our discussion of the nature of learning. My definition points to a robust inquiry into all areas of human life and thought and creative expression. The questions: what is valid? What is real? What is true? What is good? What is beautiful? Extend our minds and imaginations into every human endeavor. Together, these questions force the careful thinker to entertain implications that move us to the limits of human experience and allow us to imagine top-down answers, not just bottom-up empirical explanations. The lower levels of human knowledge and experience cannot explain the upper levels. A scale alone cannot contain the powerful complexity of a sonata or a symphony. The axiom mentioned earlier is essential. Fact and value, reason and imagination, truth and meaning must be linked together and related to the notion of human flourishing. The patterns of human reasoning, passion, moral knowledge, and experience reflected in the wide reading of our common history are deeply, deeply instructive. The effort to reduce all human experience to one principle, or to the struggle between two competing forces, or to a pluralism in continuous flux without a center or a telos, is utterly inadequate. Mystery is here. Freedom and order are bound together. Complexities and simples overlap and intertwine dynamically. There are profound differences between knowledge and wisdom. Imagination needs limits as much as room to roam. Humility is essential. In opposition to Weber's analysis, I am sounding the call to a new enchantment of our understanding of reality. I'm proposing that the longing for goodness, truth, and beauty is deeply embedded in each human soul. I am suggesting that materialistic naturalism cannot provide a basis for reason or self-consciousness. I'm offering the possibility for deep meaning, a meaning that arises not from the isolated human self, but floods into persons in relationship from one whose goodness is powerful and whose power is goodness. How can we proceed? What are the next steps? In learning from Wartime, Lewis provides some clues. No time is any better or worse than now to hear the call. To engage the past, to walk with deep thinkers, to dream with creatives from faraway times and places, and to listen to the song of the music of the sphere that weaves through every human heart. If this is your calling, then please, for the sake of the world, pursue it. But pursue it for the right reasons and for the right ends. Lewis writes, St. Paul tells people to get on with their jobs. He even assumes that Christians may go to dinner parties, and what's more, dinner parties with pagans. Our Lord attends a wedding and provides miraculous wine. Under the aegis of His church, in the most Christian ages, learning and the arts flourish. The solution of the paradox is, of course, well known to you, and you've already heard it. Whether you eat or drink or whatsoever ye do, do all for the glory of God. Lewis provides us with 3 timely warnings for learning in wartime. The first warning is against the distraction from learning caused by the excitement of the war and the horror of the news about it. Our contemporary situation is even worse than his. A wide range of media, plus a poverty of ethical restraint, layered over by deep divided partisan voices and punctuated by the steady drumbeat of passionate hyperbole creates a cacophony of distraction that makes real study and thinking difficult. I urge you to be discerning and turn away from most media that comes your way. Read deeply. Track ideas back to their sources. Explore the full range of great books. Learn the power of all ideas to sway behavior and culture. Beware of efforts to inflame your emotions by pulling you one way or another and exacting a cost in time and money. Discover the kind of satire and comedy that lifts you up and does not fill you with greater hostility. A second warning concerns frustration. This frustration is caused by the fear that you will never comprehend it all, or finish the task before you, or understand that difficult book, or fully appreciate that complex symphony. If we do what we do as unto the Lord, and trust that others will take our efforts and build upon them as unto the Lord, then all will be well. Faithfulness to God and to His good gifts is all we can do. A third warning from Lewis is even closer to our situation. Fear can cause us to freeze. In the last 2 years, we have been entrapped by the power of fear. We have been confronted anew by the reality of death. We will all die. This world is not our ultimate home. The poignant beauty of Tolkien's vision of Rivendell, the last homely home, lies in its inevitable abandonment and loss. We will all come face to face with the Creator God. The biblical message calls us to faith and hope. Fear not is the message. The God of creation is the God of redemption. One last warning or encouragement I draw from my own journey. The careful linkage of fact and value, reason and imagination, truth and meaning, with a full concept of human flourishing, could be understood as providing the elements of a biblically informed definition of faith. The task of learning that leads to wisdom demands faith. Not blind trust, but not blind faith, but deep trust. Not superficial feelings, but loyalty to a person whom we trust with our lives. Not selfish action, but a lifelong commitment to transformative love. Real faith is open to the mystery and wonder. Real faith embraces the deep meaning of our embodied existence and dares to acknowledge that human knowledge is not sufficient to answer the question, why? As a Christian thinker, I am convinced that the cipher of the mystery of life is discovered in a stable. Maybe you will catch the source of this dialogue. About a half an hour later, or it might have been a half 100 years later, for time there is not like time here, Lucy stood with her dear friend, her oldest Narnian friend, the fawn Tumnus, looking down the wall of that garden and seeing all Narnia spread out below. But when you looked down, you found that this hill was much higher than you thought. It sank down with shining cliffs thousands of feet below them, and trees in that lower world looked no bigger than grains of green salt. Then she turned inward again and stood with her back to the wall and looked at the garden. "I see," she said at last thoughtfully. "I see now. This garden is like the stable. It is far bigger inside than it was outside." "Of course, daughter of Eve," said the fawn. "The further up and the further in you go, the bigger everything gets. The inside is larger than the outside." The call to real learning and real education is to go further up and further in. Thank you.